Okay, today we're going to be talking about very foreign policy. Here we go. And basically, this is going to be a discussion of the collapse of détente after Vietnam, and then Iran, the situation in Iran that occurs during Jimmy Carter's presidency, and then the situation in Afghanistan, which begins during the Carter presidency and then carries through all the way through the Reagan presidency. All right, so let's get the old PowerPoint up here, our application screen. All right. Détente began to collapse after 1975. There were a number of moves made by the Soviet Union that brought a collapse of détente. U.S. military power really retreated after Vietnam. And so the Soviets made several moves. Angola in 1975, civil war between communist and non-communist forces. Congress will not allow President Ford to help the non-communists. And so eventually Angola will go communist, as will Somalia and Mozambique. So a lot of African countries falling to communism in the mid-70s. Some old American naval bases. Somebody just rang the doorbell. Hold on. Just some salesman. Some old U.S. naval bases are taken over by the Soviets. An old British naval base is taken over by the Soviets. The civil war in Ethiopia between communist and non-communist forces. In this case, East Germany and Cuba, sending forces to Ethiopia to help that country go communist. In 1979, is won by the communist Sandinistas. And we're going to come back to Nicaragua when we get to the Reagan lecture. And then finally, I keep saying finally, and then as well, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which we're going to look at in much greater detail momentarily. So again, we have all of these events happening after Vietnam, where the Soviet Union is definitely on the march. Angola, lots of Africa, civil wars in Central America, and the invasion of Afghanistan. So this pretty much does away with détente. Carter will slowly begin to let go of détente. And of course, Reagan will completely shift away from it to a completely new thing. Reagan won't even go back to containment. Reagan will go to something called rollback, which we'll look at when we get into the Reagan period. The Carter presidency is, of course, also known for the situation in Iran, which broke out in Carter's presidency. Now, as a review, you'll recall that back in 1953, the CIA had helped overthrow Iran's government and install the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Pahlavi. We provided the Shah with military aid because he was anti-communist. And if some of that military aid was used against the Iranian people, we were willing to look the other way. This is something that we talked about at the end of the Korean War, where the United States was willing to partner with what are essentially dictatorships, as long as those dictatorships were sufficiently anti-communist. And so this is one of the places where that occurred, was here in Iran. Now, revolutions make strange bedfellows, because two groups in Iran are going to, who normally would have hated each other, are going to join together to help overthrow the Shah. Okay, one are the Ayatollahs, and these are the Islamic fundamentalists who still run Iran today. The other were Iran socialists. Now again, normally these two groups would hate each other, but they have a common enemy in the Shah of Iran. And so these two groups join forces. Again, the Shah is very corrupt. A lot of political repression, a lot of corruption, a lot of allowing Western influences, like letting women go out in public with their heads uncovered, having alcohol for sale, enraged this group enraged by the political repression, corruption, and so on. And so this led to the Iranian Revolution of 1978, and in fact, the Shah eventually left Iran in January of 1979. Initially, the United States attempted to forge a new relationship with the new government. We recognize that 25 years of the Shah's very oppressive regime clearly had left some scars and a lot of anger. Iran also has a lot of oil, which we would like to continue to have access to. And so the U.S. did attempt to forge a new relationship with Iran's new leaders. Unfortunately, in October of 1979, the Shah was allowed into the United States to seek cancer treatment. This caused a lot of anger in Iran, It also led to rumors that the CIA was cooking up another one of its regime changes. Rumors began to fly throughout the country that the CIA in November was going to reinstall the Shah. So on November 4th, 1979, the U.S. Embassy in Tehran was seized. And if you've seen Argo, very early in the movie, you see the overrunning of the embassy, as you can see here. All right. 52 Americans are going to be held hostage for 444 days. Initially, there were 66 hostages, but one guy was really sick. Like very early on, he got very sick, and it turned out he was coming down with multiple sclerosis, so he was cut loose, and then the other 13 were persons of color who were turned loose. So basically, the 52 who are being held are basically white Americans. They're going to be held hostage for 444 days. Okay. Iran wants an apology for the 1953 coup, something that they still want. And they want the Shah returned to Iran to stand trial. Okay. Jimmy Carter is not going to hand a man dying of cancer over to be for what would basically probably be a kangaroo court trial. If we do that, then we're going to lose a lot of the legitimacy that we have with our allies. Carter's reaction is to get an oil embargo against Iran, so many of our Western allies stop buying Iran's oil. The deportation of Iranians from the United States whose visas have expired. And the freezing of Iran's money in U.S. banks. And at this point, the situation kind of stalemated. Okay? Basically, every day, some of the hostages were marched out in front of the world's cameras to show that there was nothing the United States could do to rescue its own people. Behind the scenes in Iran, the Ayatollahs used the ongoing crisis as a cover to purge their socialist allies. Ayatollah Khomeini, quoting, "This action has many benefits." Now, the action he's talking about is letting this hostage crisis drag on. "This action has many benefits. This has united our people. Our opponents do not dare act against us. we can put the new constitution to the people's vote without difficulty and carry out presidential and parliamentary elections. And basically, the result of those elections and that new constitution was the Iran that we know today. Okay, the socialist allies who had helped overthrow the Shah of Iran are purged, and Iran's new constitution, its current constitution, where the Ayatollahs and the religious fundamentalists basically run the country. Carter did attempt a rescue what was called Operation Eagle Claw in April of 1980. The idea here is that special forces would, because all the hostages were being kept in one place, so special forces would helicopter into the embassy area, grab the hostages, take them back out, and then take off in the C-130s. Unfortunately, some of the helicopters broke down because of sandstorm conditions. The mission was aborted, but as they were taking off, one of the helicopters clipped the C-130, which exploded, killing 8 U.S. servicemen. And here you can see the wreckage. And of course, the Ayatollah claiming this was proof that Allah was protecting Iran from the great Satan, the United States. In July of 1980, Iran and Iraq began their war, which would go on for the next 8 years. And so basically, Iran decided they needed to wrap up this hostage situation once this war began. Really needed to sort of get what they could out of the hostages and move on to the next crisis. So eventually, the Algerian Accords are signed between the United States All right, so what do we got here? One, U.S. won't interfere in Iran's internal affairs, so basically we won't be sending the CIA or the army over there to interfere. And two, immunity from lawsuits by the hostages, something the hostages are still very upset about. And the unfreezing of Iran's money in U.S. banks, some of which was not unfrozen until the Obama administration. All right, so that wraps up the Iran situation. Although the Iranians, just to stick at the Jimmy Carter one more time, refused to let the hostages leave the country until after Ronald Reagan was sworn in as president. The other place where the United States found itself in a very strange situation was in Afghanistan. Afghanistan surrounded by Pakistan, and this is all former Soviet Union up here. If we look at an older map, we can see that Iran is next door. Afghanistan was already a communist country and had been for quite some time. The problem is that in April of 1978, Afghanistan's communists, who were called the PDPA, instituted some new laws which offended tribal customs that were hundreds, maybe thousands of years old. And most of these had to do around land and marriage. This was not very well received. The majority of the Afghani population still deeply immersed in their both tribal and Islamic traditions. And so a civil war erupted in Afghanistan. Pretty much almost the entire country. This led in December of 1979 to Soviet troops being sent to Afghanistan to help support the PDPA. Now, about 100,000 initially. The U.S. at this point was already supplying to the rebels. In fact, had been doing so since July of 1978. The United States had already begun supplying weapons to the rebels, what was called Operation Cyclone, which was carried out by the CIA. Basically, or let me give you dollar figures. It started with about 20 million the first year, which is 1978. By 1987, it's up to about $630 million a year. Basically, what the United States decided to do was to give the Soviet Union their own Vietnam. Okay? Again, Soviet troops are being sent to support a government that already exists. Just like the U.S. had been supporting South Vietnam, okay, the U.S. decides, here's an opportunity to give the Soviets their own version of Vietnam. Here you can see Soviet invasion routes, and pretty much along these red arrows will be the territory that the Soviets control for the rest of the war. Lots of fighting, really dominated by the Soviets during the early portion of the war, particularly because the Soviets had these helicopters and then massive tank assaults. Well, there's some Soviet boys in the area. The whole Afghanistan thing took on a massive international dimension, because eventually it wasn't just the United States who got involved in funding the Afghani rebels. The entire Islamic world got involved. Saudi Arabia, for instance, matched the US dollar for dollar. So by the time the US is sending $630 million to help the rebels, well, the Saudis are also sending $630 million. There's also many Islamic charities who got involved in supplying money and weapons. A lot of this outreach coming from Congressman Charlie Wilson, who visited Afghanistan and may or may not have taken a few pot shots at Soviet troops while he was there. Obviously, you can imagine the problems if a sitting member of Congress was found to be shooting at Soviet troops, but you also notice Charlie is armed. So a whole bunch of money pouring into the Afghani situation. The U.S. also, thanks to Charlie Wilson and the CIA, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles to knock out the Soviet advantage in air power. Now, there's a couple of problems here. In order to disguise, because the United States couldn't just come right out and be seen as giving money to the Afghani rebels, okay? I should probably stop calling them rebels and give them their proper name, the Mujahideen. That's who we're arming, but we can't have the money go directly to them because that might cause the Soviets to decide to widen their war against and attack the U.S. or attack U.S. bases or draw the U.S. in. So U.S. money had to go be passed through Pakistan's ISI, which is basically Pakistan's version of the CIA, which meant we had no control over who these funds wound up with. And so some of the funds wound up with people who really did not like the United States any more than they liked the Soviet Union. And that's going to cause problems after the war is over. All right. In addition to the Afghanis, there are also outsiders coming from Afghanistan to participate in the jihad, what were called the Afghan Arabs, non-Afghani Muslims in the jihad against the Soviet Union. Of course, the most well-known one being Osama bin Laden. Lots of what the Soviets referred to as terrorist activity, roadside bombings, booby traps, blowing up radio stations, blowing up government buildings, blowing up hotels, blowing up cinemas, use of landmines, again, what were called terrorist acts by the Soviets. Car bombs, assassinations, even Mujahideen raiding into the Soviet Union, okay, and being taught to do so by the CIA. Soviet losses over 10 years, 14,000 killed, 469,000 sick and wounded. That has a lot to do with typhoid, hepatitis, cholera, Afghanistan sanitary conditions probably not up to par. 1 million Afghans are killed, 5 million flee to Pakistan and Iran, 2 million Afghanis displaced within the country. In the 1980s, 1 out of every 2 refugees in the world was from Afghanistan. 3 million non-combatants maimed or wounded. Afghanistan's irrigation systems, which are vitally important, are completely destroyed by the war. Landmines, again, civilian population. There's still a lot of landmines that were being cleared up over the last 20 years. By the late 1980s, we're looking at 31% child mortality rate, 67% of children severely malnourished. Once the Soviets withdrew, the Americans left as well. And this became a serious issue after 9/11 because U.S. after this war did not help with reconstruction. Okay, Afghanistan had been blown to hell in a 10-year period, and the U.S. decided it wasn't going to stick around to help rebuild Afghanistan. That creates a power vacuum, which is going to be filled, I misspelled vacuum, creates a power vacuum that's going to be filled by the Mujahideen favored by Pakistan's ISI. And some of those Mujahideen become the Taliban. And we all know what happens after that. This is one reason why the United States has been, at least up until recently, like in the last few days, we've been very hesitant about leaving Afghanistan while the country was still in such dire shape. But now we're in the process of doing that. And who knows what the consequences are going to be. After the September 11th attacks, and really all throughout the 90s, certain members of the U.S. intelligence agency who had been raising the alarm about Islamic fundamentalism, it turned out those guys were right. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about here comes from a book by Lawrence Wright called The Looming Tower, about the rise of Al-Qaeda and the road to 9/11. But after 9/11, a lot of U.S. intelligence, as well as journalists and scholars, began wondering, where exactly did this strain of Islam come from? The one followed by the Taliban, the one followed by bin Laden. What are the roots of this? Where did it come from? And a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it can be traced back to an Egyptian named, and I'm sure I'm butchering this name, Said Qutb. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Perhaps Google can tell me. Let's see. Nope.
Qutb.
Qutb. All right.
Qutb.
Qutb. Well, that was very wrong. All right. So it's sort of a Qutb. 1909, 1966, Egyptian. He had been brought up sort of middle class in Egypt. His father was well known for political activism. He got a good education. There is one thing, I don't want to sound like an apologist for colonialism, but Britain did put in an educational system for some, not all, some Egyptians during the time where they ruled over Egypt. So he got a really good education, is what I'm trying to say here. And he eventually became a teacher. At some point, he journeyed to the United States. And it was during World War II. Let me see if I can get you an exact year. 19, where is his 2-year role? America, Western tradition, 1948. 1948, so after the war, my bad. Visits in 1948. He's there for about 2 years. And it's really here. He spent some time in Washington, D.C., and then he spent some time in Greeley, Colorado, and some time at Stanford in California. And when he returns, he publishes this article, which I would encourage you to read. You can find it on the internet. He's not particularly impressed by America, and some of his criticisms are valid. He feels that Americans are materialistic. He's highly critical of American racism, our lack of sophistication in art. Okay, I'll give him that one. Sports enthusiasm. Okay. Shallow religious commitment. Okay. These are criticisms I make of America. Then things go a little farther. Okay, men and women allowed to sit next to each other in church. Sexuality of American women, and I will quote, "The American girl is well acquainted with her body's seductive capacity. She knows it lies in the face and in expressive eyes and thirsty lips. She knows seductiveness lies in the round breasts, the full buttocks, and in the shapely thighs, sleek legs. She knows this and she does not hide it. And apparently, at some point, he was crossing the United States on a train, and a woman knocked on his door, and I guess he'd met her earlier and had a conversation with her. But basically, she was like, I want to spend the night with you. Okay. So that type of open, brazen sexuality he found disturbing. And then, honest to God, I shit you not, at some point he got a really bad haircut. Okay. So again, you can find this, you can read it. Part of it is, some of it is, yeah, I would make these criticisms about America. But this stuff, this is like when Americans travel overseas and then they're kind of upset because they can't find the McDonald's. They kind of expect every place to be like America. That's what a lot of this is. Okay, women and men sit together in church. It's just the way we roll here. Sexuality of American women, it's just the way it rolls here. Poor haircuts, we've all gotten them. Here's another quote. The American people are numb to faith in religion, faith in art, and faith in spiritual values altogether. Return to Egypt. Now, at this point, he seemed to reject Western ideas. He joined the Muslim Brotherhood, became their editor of their newspaper and pretty much all of their print materials. In 1952, Britain's pro-British government was overthrown by General Nasser. Okay. Who was supported by the Brotherhood. The Brotherhood were hoping Nasser would implement a strict Islamic-based government. Nasser did not. And what we're talking about is like banning alcohol, all the restrictions about how women have to be dressed when they go out in public, those kind of things. Nasser did not do any of those things, and in 1954, the Brotherhood tried to kill Nasser, which Nasser did not take well, as you can imagine. And so a lot of the Brotherhood was sent off to Egyptian prisons, which even on their best day, even if you're not in an Egyptian prison because you tried to kill the leader of your country, it's still not a good place to be. If you are in there because you tried to kill the leader of your country, you are truly and woefully fucked. He was initially sentenced to death but he's just thrown into prison for a while. He was tortured for the first few years, but eventually he's not so much tortured, he's held. He is given the opportunity to write, and he is given the opportunity to receive visitors. Now that's going to be important here in a few minutes. He's let out in 1964. Rearrested 8 months later, executed 1966. His writings, remember, he was writing before he went to prison, and then during his stay in prison, he was allowed to write. And it's really his writings that sort of formed the basis for a much more strict interpretation of Islam than what was popular during the 1950s and 60s. And, anti-Western, anti-Western values, wanting Westerners out of the Middle East. A lot of his writings are distributed by his brother, Qutb, who became a professor and who basically wrote, edited his brother's work. And then from there, it goes to people like Ayman Zawahiri, who later becomes a mentor of Osama bin Laden. So if you're looking at this from I don't want this to sound blasphemous, but from a Christian viewpoint, if Said is the Christ figure, the one who reinterprets the law in a new way, his brother is the Paul figure, the one who spreads the message to the wider world and has disciples of his own. I guess Ayman would be, I don't know, Timothy, I guess. I don't know. The analogy kind of falls apart after a while. But his brother is really the one who spreads that message of a much more strict interpretation of Islam that will take root, particularly within the Taliban and within Al-Qaeda and some of the various offshoots that we've been dealing with. Right. So just sort of a wrap up there. Of course, this is an ongoing thing. Our next and final lecture, will it be one lecture or two? I think I can do it in one. Will be Reagan. It will be our final lecture. It will be the lectures that cover the Reagan presidency. All right, so I will see you back here for, there we are, the Reagan presidency in our next video, which will be the final lecture for the semester. All right.